Okay. Hello everyone, welcome to 12th Moving Forward RBE online meeting. So it's been a while since we had last meeting, it was last year. So I hope everyone is enjoying 2018 so far. So before I jump into the presentation, I have a good news to share with all of you. So our Facebook page for the network already got 400 followers. Thanks to all of you, yes. So the topic today is critical mass and social transformation, and the presenter is our Sherlock. So now I'm going to hand over the meeting to our presenter. Yeah.
Thanks, Stephanie. I hope this is going to work. I'm going to do my best. Yeah, I really hate this. Yeah, there you are. And here I go, I hope. Okay, great. Okay, so you guys can see it, I suppose. So welcome to the presentation about achieving critical mass for social transformation. This is a subject which has really been on my mind these past few weeks, considering how things have been heating up around the world, and also being present at the World Summit mini conference in the beginning of January. So I decided to look at this subject in terms of a historical review in order to make a current prognosis. Now, most of you know me. This information is pretty much just about my educational, professional, and political background, with a view for the people who will be viewing this presentation online. I'll be uploading the presentation apart from the meeting so people who don't have the time to watch the whole meeting can see it. But as you know, I've been busy working for social change most of my life, and that's how I got to know all of you. So the subject of today is achieving critical mass for social transformation. And the point I'm going to try to be making is that I believe that the situation which makes change necessary now is unprecedented, and that's why it requires a new approach. So to do that, we need to look at how these changes have occurred in the past in order to intelligently work towards a better future. In order to make this subject clear, we're going to be looking at 5 different sections of the presentation. First of all, I'd like to look at stages of history and the characteristics associated with them. Then look at specific factors in the rise of property and civilizations. Then look at elements and stages in the rise and fall of civilizations, and an analysis of the current civilization and critical mass, and then look at how we're going to break the cycle that has doomed us through history so far. Now, as you're used to, this is a pretty lengthy presentation, so I'll be stopping at points if you have any questions, and if there is something that isn't clear, just let me know. So first of all, I'd like to look at different stages of history, but before we do so, it's important to get clear on what exactly history is. When most people refer to history, they usually have the idea that this is some kind of fact or some kind of universal facts that are set in stone. But history is actually always told from a particular point of view, and that's usually of the current ruling class. In fact, the word itself, his story, shows that it's often told from a masculine point of view. Women's history usually covers ways that women have been allowed to participate in male-dominated structures. So we're going to be looking at history from a particular point of view. And for the division of history, I have chosen the Marxist categorization of different stages. which is based on economic factors and labor relations. And I think that is the most appropriate for our discussion, since we are also concerned about working towards a moneyless system. So the stages that Marx outlined, there were 6 of them, and the first stage was also called primitive communism, and this was the time of the hunter-gatherer. The second stage was when agriculture came about and was characterized by a slave society, master-slave relationships, and private property. The third stage came about when the aristocracy and the theocracy, or church, became the ruling powers, and this gave rise to the period of feudalism. Then we go on to the fourth stage, which is the market economy that gave rise to capitalism, and when the middle class comes into being. And that has grown into an imperialist type of world network with various global monopolies. Then Marx envisioned a fifth stage, which he called socialism, in which property is made common. All decisions are made in a council sort of setting, and money was replaced with types of labor vouchers. And the sixth stage, which he called communism, was without government, without classes, without property, without money. And actually, all of this was sort of seen as prehistory by Marx. He felt that actually only when we got rid of money, classes, and property would the true history of mankind ever come into being. So some of this probably sounds pretty familiar to what many of us envisage in the future. Now, as I mentioned, I was really curious about how property in agricultural civilization came into being. This past week, I came across an article in The Guardian about the relative affluence of hunter-gatherer society. And in this article, there was the quote, "Most of the lives of hunter-gatherers are not spent at a workplace away from friends and family, but in talking, resting, sharing, and celebrating. In short, in being human. This is an ideal of modern Western society expressed in the major religions and in popular culture, but it is largely unrealized. In fact, if anybody enjoys this kind of lifestyle, it's usually people with a lot of money." So I had to ask myself, if these hunter-gatherers were having such a great time of it, why would they give this kind of lifestyle up? I thought about it and I figured, well, maybe they had some kind of environmental disaster which caused them to have to leave where they had been living, or they had some kind of economic or food shortage. Perhaps they came across some developments in weapons or agriculture which caused them to want to cultivate land and stay in one place. Or maybe there was some kind of strong leader who had a good idea or told them that he had divine inspiration that many leaders today like to say. Or perhaps it was just a combination of all of the above. And with these ideas, I imagined that a tribe would be forced from the environment through some kind of disaster or other development and had very little food, and perhaps they had some kind of advanced technology or clever leader. So they would develop agriculture, give up the nomadic life, and acquire abundance. With this abundance, there would come into being some kind of property idea. Although hunter-gatherers are very much into sharing, I think in this kind of scenario, people would still remember the fear of scarcity, and that might have gotten them to want to hang on to whatever they had made and get the idea of property. So without sharing as a basic social reality, one settlement would be acquiring abundance and keeping it for themselves, which means that other tribes who didn't have something might start attacking them. Now, this is all very theoretical, but I was just trying to get an idea of how did the first sort of civilization based on money and property come into being. So basically, I did some research and I found out that I wasn't too much off the mark with what I thought. Most history buffs attribute social change to the following 4 elements. The first one is political or leadership. The second is military, sometimes accompanied with advanced technology. The third factor is economic, also sometimes accompanied by technology. And of course, social or cultural developments. And this often has to do with some kind of new ideology or some kind of religious movement. Now, for the examples of the stages of history that I want to look at, I chose 4 examples. The first one to represent slave society is the Roman Empire. The second one, the British Empire, will represent feudal society. The third of capitalism will be the U.S. Empire. And the fourth one, the U.S.S.R. bloc, will represent at least an attempt at socialism. As time and space are limited, and these are not actually an analysis of this, is not really the point of the presentation, I'm going to move somewhat quickly through this section, just highlighting the key points, and you can review the full text if you want to look at the presentation later. So, the Roman Empire was at its height, of course, in 117 BC, and it was, for the time, the most wealthy and extensive political and social structure ever. They were able to achieve this in terms of economic on the basis of slave labor. The military element was, of course, the Roman legion. It was highly disciplined and well-trained and had a decisive was a decisive factor in gaining new territory and expanding the empire. The political aspect of the Roman Empire was the fact that Rome was the first city-state. Now, at first, it had a Senate, which sort of took over the idea from Greece of democracy. But after Julius Caesar became the first dictator, the Roman Empire reverted to an empire ruled by one emperor, and that was how it was run until its downfall. The social and cultural aspect that led to the rise of the Roman Empire was the fact that they were able to take over a lot of the structures from the Greeks, who were in decline, and they became the new shining light of civilization. This idea, which you may have seen in the film Gladiator, the idea of Rome as a shining light of civilization, that inspired a great deal of loyalty, and leaders like Marcus Aurelius were able to get people to fight for him and fight for this dream based on that idea. The fall of the Roman Empire came about through economic, military, political, and social difficulties. Their economic difficulties came from too much reliance on slave labor. So when the slaves revolted and left, their whole economy went into shambles. Moreover, a great proportion of their money was spent on the military, which left very little for domestic necessities. The military difficulties were, first of all, a combination of the weakening of the Roman legion. People no longer wanted to join the army, so the legion had to get a lot of mercenary fighters, and they were not loyal to the dream of Rome. And so when the Huns, Attila the Hun in particular, and his army attacked, they could not defend themselves. The political difficulties really reached a head when the Roman Empire split into 2. There was the Eastern Empire, located in Constantinople, and the Western Empire in Rome. However, the resources were pretty much centered in the eastern area, and the attacks by the Huns were pretty much on Rome itself. So eventually, the empire fell because of this political division. And Christianity also had a major influence in destabilizing the government. It became, of course, the official religion under, what was his name? Augustus? I can't remember now. But in any case, the slaves really embraced this new religion, which promised them a better life in the afterworld, and this brought about a loss of traditional values. So the very factor which caused Rome to rise also led to its fall. Then, of course, after the fall of the Roman civilization, the first real feudal civilization in Europe was really represented by the British Empire. The strong point that they had in terms of economy was the fact that they had a very strong naval fleet. They had a very good sense of navigation, and they were able to use this to colonize different countries around the world. Moreover, later on in their history, they had the Industrial Revolution, which made them the first capitalist nation state. In terms of military, the boats and navy were also essential in their domination. In fact, the establishment of Greenwich Mean Time allowed them to be able to sail across the ocean, precisely planning their route, which allowed them to go thousands and thousands of miles and not lose their way. Other European countries were also fighting a lot among themselves, so England was left to take over control of much of the new colonies. Britain was also the first country to establish a nation state. And the break with the Catholic Church gave it immense freedom to get people to become loyal to the king and country rather than the Catholic Church. So all of these factors led it to becoming one of the widespread empires of history. In fact, in the beginning of the 20th century, it had control of more than a quarter of the world's population and a quarter of all of the land in the world. But as you can see from the chart here, this was not to remain. Especially the economic problems around the turn of the century led to a great fall in the importance and income of the British Empire. The cost of wars also was an economic factor, and they went bankrupt, much as the United States did in the 1920s. Moreover, the continued wars in Africa and in the colonies and in Europe led to a decimation of their military force, and they were unable to defend their colonial power. Politically, when they started losing their colonies, people began losing faith in them, and the whole empire just gradually started to crumble. And again, just as in Rome, when the dream or ideal of the elevated British culture began to crumble, people also no longer had any interest in maintaining this empire. So again, we see some circumstances which resemble those of Rome. Now, I chose to look at the U.S.S.R. before the United States, since the Eastern Bloc, or the Russian Bloc, has already fallen, whereas that of the United States is still in its death throes. So I'd like now to look at the rise of the U.S.S.R. bloc and see how that was able to be achieved. Of course, after the revolution of 1917, the new structure of government allowed them to centralize economic distribution and decisions. This led to a great advance in the way Russia was able to produce goods and distribute it around the country. Moreover, all of these countries in one great United States Socialist Republic gave it vast natural resources and labor. In terms of military, the Soviet played a decisive role in World War II, and its scientific advancements kept the US military in check. For instance, the nuclear bomb, the space race, all those things. The U.S.S.R. was right up with the United States, or even ahead of it in a great deal of its history. Politically, I think its success had to do with, at least in the beginning, strong leadership. Leaders such as Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev were able to mobilize worldwide opinion, as well as the differing people within the USSR, to get together around a common goal, namely building up the USSR. And of course, they had the ideology that communism was good and that capitalists were bad, and were able to unite people under this banner. However, the same problems that we see with Britain and with Rome also beset the USSR. For one thing, the amount of money they had to spend on their military and the vast distribution of the military around the world made it economically impossible to support agriculture and growth. This led to an insurmountable crisis for which they had to borrow money from the West. Now, this was obviously not an ideal situation, as Western banks tended to restrict the operation of the USSR. Moreover, the military had to keep up with the US at any cost, which meant an extreme investment in its military weaponry and research. In terms of the political ideology, the Communist Party increasingly started to fall apart from the rule of Brezhnev and afterwards. Corruption, alcoholism, and drug addiction among the leadership became rampant, and under Perestroika, Gorbachev met so much resistance from the military that he had to disband the USSR, otherwise there would have been a military coup. In terms of social and cultural problems besetting the USSR, there was increasing class division as the leadership became more and more privileged, and farmers and workers were only given the bare minimum. And Gorbachev was also removed two of the factors which many analysts say kept the USSR intact. Namely, Gorbachev took away fear of the Communist Party and fear of an outside threat, the USA. So because of that, people no longer remained loyal to the Communist Party, and this also brought about its fall. Now, the final country I wanted to look at was the U.S. empire. First of all, in terms of economy, the expansion of the original 13 colonies to the Pacific coast brought an immense number of resources and wealth to them. They made rapid technological development, and this led to automation, and they were able to expand even beyond borders in a global network of interests and companies abroad. In terms of the military, they had advanced weaponry, which first of all defeated the Native Americans, and later on led to their decisive victory in World War I when they deployed the nuclear bomb. Politically, they were able to rise to an empire based on the consolidation of a two-party system, which seemed to give a democratic choice. They established a systems of checks and balances, and they gave everybody the idea that anybody could become the president. Their social and cultural advantage was that they took over many of the philosophies that were going around in France about liberté, égalité, and fraternité, liberty, equality, and brotherhood, and were able to say that these were the principles that the United States was based on, so that everybody would be equal, everybody would have opportunities, and there would be justice for all. But again, the economic, military, political, and social difficulties are leading slowly but surely into the fall of the United States empire. There's increased competition from China and Europe. There's the growth of automation and increased unemployment. The military has been increasingly undermined in various wars around the world, from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Politically, the Congress is increasingly controlled by interest groups. Corruption has been found at the highest levels, and most people have become very much dissatisfied with the way the United States seems to be practicing democracy. And finally, there is a great cultural revolution going on in the United States. On the one hand, you have this extreme wealthy class of people who are leading decadent lives in huge houses, luxurious cars, and all kinds of things like that. And the most prisoners, the most serial killers, and probably the most homeless people in all of the developed world. So the overview of these four countries shows four basic elements to the rise and fall of civilizations. Economic growth comes through newly gained resources and technology. Military advantage comes through the new organization and technology. Political ideology or leadership inspires the masses. And social and cultural advantages of previous cultures are used to its benefit. The four elements related to the fall of a civilization are when the economic basis becomes unstable, usually related to the workforce that it has. The military becomes too widely spread around its territories and too expensive to maintain. The political ideology becomes undermined, or the leadership becomes weak, and there is increased social cultural conflict and dissent. Now, these points are going to show us, on the one hand, where we can start taking advantage of the weaknesses in the failing capitalist culture, and what sort of things we need to pay attention to, the pitfalls we need to pay attention to when we try to give rise to a better civilization. Another analysis of empires has said that there are basically just 6 stages of an empire. You have the first 3, which are those of the stage of the pioneers, the age of commerce, and the age of affluence, and the last 3. Now, the first 3, there is fresh energy. It's usually some kind of new situation. Either a new place has been conquered, or a broken country is rebuilding itself. Then they establish networks of commerce and trade and are able to develop wealth. And then they reach a point that they have a great amount of affluence, and they think things are going to stay like this forever. But similar to Marx's application of dialectics to historical economics, in which each new phase includes the seed of its own destruction, the period of affluence is where civilization stands at a turning point towards decline. Stage 4 is the stage of intellect. And this may seem contradictory. You might think the more people are able to study, the more people are able to learn, the better things will get. But actually, this, according to analysts, this is a sign that the empire is already in trouble and is unable to prevent its decay. Stage 5 is the age of decadence. So this is the stage that people choose to go on with a lifestyle which is clearly unsustainable, but they do keep on doing it anyway. Poor people would rather try and become like the decadent rich than get rid of the society which has made them poor. People have the idea that the more they consume, the more material goods they have, the happier they will become. And finally, the sixth age of empire is the age of distraction. So people unable to deal with the difficulties and the pain that so many people are suffering, distract themselves with all kinds of ridiculous types of activities. They worship celebrities, they have reality TV, they get obsessed with sex and alcohol, drug abuse comes to the point of unconsciousness, and because people are denied any kind of meaningful employment, any kind of meaningful way to pass their time, this leads to self-destructive ways of living. So I think if we look at the current situation, it should be pretty clear that the U.S. is in the stage 6 of the lifetime of the empire. On the other hand, the global connectedness of the economy keeps all countries propping up the U.S. Situation, because for it to fall apart would mean chaos in the whole world market. Obviously, the dissatisfaction, as well as in democratic countries, will lead both opportunities and dangers. So I'd like to now look at the current situation in terms of the economic, political, military, and cultural situation that we find ourselves in now. As you can see from this chart, unemployment is different in various parts of the world. The dark green at the top of the chart is only 0 to 5%, whereas the dark brown here at the bottom is 30 to 35%. Now you see a large part, North America and the United Soviet Socialist Republic, great deal of South America and Africa and Australia only seem to suffer 5 to 10%. But this is, again, very much achieved by an artificial way of keeping people at work. And we'll see that in further slides. But even for the people who do have a job, this doesn't mean that they're actually satisfied with what they have to do. Roughly 3 billion people are employed, where 205 people are unemployed. But if you look at the survey of U.S. adults carried out in the United States, a great number of them are dissatisfied with the work they have to do. And the level of satisfaction is obviously related to how much money they make. Moreover, as I mentioned, the statistics for unemployment are not entirely accurate. The statistics do not include so-called employment dropouts. These are people who have even stopped looking for a job because of the inability to find one. So as you can see, although the official unemployment rate here in blue is only 5.5%, and the Trump administration is actually saying that unemployment has been falling, if you take into account the people who are not even looking for a job anymore because of inability to find one, unemployment is much closer to 10 and 11%. Another factor which is discouraging the labor force in the United States in any case is the distribution of labor over different age groups. This chart shows that the majority of jobs are being filled by people between the ages of 45 and 64. So, of course, millennials who are trying to find a job to pay off the huge student loan that they've had to take in order to qualify for some kind of entry position have very little chance of being able to get these. The last bit of economic factors that I'd like to take a look at is the prognosis for the amount of risk different countries have for jobs being replaced by automation. Now, when you look at these charts, you might actually be a little bit surprised because Ethiopia has the risk of 85% of its work being automized, whereas the US has only 47% risk, or 47% of all jobs at risk, and the UK only 35%. Now, this seems sort of unusual, and I think there might be a couple of explanations for it. First of all, I believe that in the more advanced countries upon which the global economy is dependent, they keep people employed in unnecessary jobs in order to avoid any kind of social revolution or people becoming not having enough money to pay for all the products that they're making. Another explanation is the fact that these countries have more gradually eased into automation because of their advanced technological capabilities, which makes the impact perhaps a little bit less severe. But I still think that the countries with the greatest risk of jobs being lost to automation are basically run by governments who don't very much care what happens to its people. They are more concerned in increasing the GDP, the gross domestic profit, and productivity, and they're more concerned about that than they are about what kind of suffering their people will possibly have to go through if they lose their work. So these factors are current elements which are driving the world towards a new change, a new transfer of civilization. The next area that I wanted to look at was the military, because this is another element that we found to be important in the rise and fall of an empire. Now, when you see this chart, you can quickly conclude that the United States has not learned anything from history about investing too much of its money into the military and spreading it over too many countries. But the next slides have to do with the deplorable situations that are waiting for people who serve in the armed forces in the United States. This chart shows that more than a third of the people who return from military service suffer some kind of traumatic brain injury and or some form of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the sad part of this is that owing to various factors, many of the people suffering from these health problems do not receive the type of treatment that they actually need. This slide shows that a terrible consequence of these health problems is that an estimated of 22 veterans commit suicide each day. Now, I consider this to be tragic in a country that is says that it supports the military so much. These people are not getting the help they need. They are not getting the support they need, either because they're talked into thinking that they should be able to handle this all by themselves, or they are just not given the funding that's needed to deal with these problems. Another disturbing factor related to the veterans is the level of homelessness that is prevalent in the United States. As you can see in this chart, the African American men between the age of 31 and 61 are the veterans who are hardest hit for homelessness. And for me, this is completely incomprehensible, how a country could let so many people who have been told that they are serving their country just have no home or no kind of treatment or no kind of support that they need. So there is reason to believe that not only do the current logistical and economic factors surrounding the U.S. military undermines its future effectiveness, but also the horrific conditions surrounding benefits and the lack of loyalty that this may give rise to among them to the concept of, quote, making America great again. The third element that I wanted to look at now is an analysis of current political factors. Now, this chart shows that the level of trust in countries, so going on the left from the least amount of trust in the government to the right to the most amount of trust in the government, is directly related to the average gross domestic profit growth. In other words, if there is no growth in domestic profit, there is very little trust in the government. Whereas if there is an 8% growth in domestic profit, the countries do have trust in the government. Now here again in the middle, you see that it's split on both sides. But I tend to think that those who are, the countries who are unsatisfied are the ones in which the profit of gross national profit is only experienced primarily by the wealthy class. Whereas those who have more trust in the government and have medium GDP growth also experience more distribution of the wealth among the middle class. So this may account for the division of trust between various countries in the middle range. Two other ways of looking at this aspect of trust in democracy are shown in these two charts. The chart on the left shows that the majority of countries in the West are dissatisfied with the way democracy is working. In Asia, the majority is satisfied. The Middle East and Africa are dissatisfied. And in South America, the majority, the great majority, is dissatisfied with the way democracy is working. This is also mirrored in how people report that they have trust that the government is doing the right thing, given in the chart on the right. Even if people said that they thought their government was doing the right thing, very few of them said that they had a lot of confidence in the government. Most of them said they just had some confidence in the government. And so this is another sign that people around the world are becoming less convinced of the ideology of democracy, and that there is growing dissatisfaction with this political form. Oops, I think I skipped one. Oh, yes. And then I finally wanted to look at the social and cultural factors. And first I wanted to look at the number of groups there are worldwide and domestically for social change. Now, in the book Blessed Unrest that was published in 2006, Hawkins, the author Hawkins, estimated that there were 250,000 different groups and movements for social or environmental change. Given the influence of social media and the growth of difficulties, the United Earth Society estimates that that figure would have grown to 500,000 or 1 million different movements or groups, NPOs, NGOs in the world today, which would approximately, if you gave that, say about 300 people per group, you come up with 350 million people. According to the National Capital Institute run by Hawkins, there are 100,000 of these groups now, today, this day, in the US alone. And last year, Mark Zuckerberg gave a long 5,000-word so-called manifesto about the social benefits that Facebook has. And he said that there were 1 million meaningful groups on Facebook alone. Now, if you look at the great number of groups which are working towards social change or environmental change, and you consider that critical mass is considered to be about 5 to 10% of the population, that means with about 375 to 750 million people, we have achieved that number. You also see in these tables how the growth in non-governmental organizations and the growth in intergovernmental organizations internationally has grown between 1960 and 2006. You see that there has been incredible growth in these organizations, which reflects the numbers that Hawkins and Unity have published. But what is most interesting is how political analysts see the increase in non-governmental organizations in China as something which is considered to be potentially destabilizing or a difficult trend. Obviously, for a country like China, which is so highly organized by the government, to have such a rise of non-government organizations shows that even their structure is facing some kind of instability. Nonprofit organizations are another factor which is leading to more organization for change. According to the Tax Bureau, the most common type of nonprofit organization in the United States is Section 501, which means organizations that have to do with welfare, social welfare, education, and charitable organizations, as well as scientific pursuits. You see here again that within the last 2 or 3 decades, there has been an exponential growth in these types of organizations. Now, before I go on to talking about critical mass, about how all these developments, so the development in the economy, developments in the military, developments in political realm, and in social cultural realm, are leading to social transformation groups reaching critical mass, I want to talk a little bit more about that. The term critical mass is used to describe in physics the amount of uranium that is necessary in order to reach a certain combustible point. But in social dynamics, it means the number of people who adopt a new way of doing things or a new innovation in a social system, so that the rate that other people adopt it becomes self-sustaining, and it creates further growth. Some people use the term critical mass, however, in a way which is not entirely scientific or not entirely accurate. And Rupert Sheldrake explains in a video that I've listed here. I'm not going to show it now, but he shows how some people have the wrong idea about what critical mass actually is. Now, for those of you who don't know what the 100th monkey effect is, the story, the most common version, is that Japanese researchers were throwing sweet potatoes onto the sand of a beach to feed a certain race of monkeys. One female monkey didn't like the taste of sand, so she started washing off the sweet potato in the ocean. She thought this was so great that she taught this trick to her mother, and her mother taught it to her girlfriend and to her husband. And pretty soon, more and more monkeys were all washing their sweet potatoes in the ocean, until the story goes, when the 100th monkey started to do that, suddenly all the monkeys in this race started doing that all over the world. Now, Sheldrake says that the real story behind this is somewhat different. Actually, Japanese scientists have found that once a certain group of monkeys learned to wash the potatoes on one island, monkeys on other islands learned to do the same thing much more quickly. So he said people saw this in a book and they started telling each other the story, and with each new telling, the story got more and more interesting, until now it sounds like some kind of magic was involved. But we are not going to be using stories of magic in our social transformation. Just as Sheldrake says, he prefers to look at critical mass in the same way the 1000th rat experiment was performed, which does have a scientific basis. The 1000th rat experiment were a series of experiments with rats in which successive generations of rats were able to find their way out of a maze more quickly without having seen it before. So the children of rats who had learned to get out of the maze were able to do so more quickly, until after 2 or 3 generations, the rats went right for the escape hatch. So this supports Sheldrake's own hypothesis of formative causation, and recent research has shown that people inherit certain World War II traumas through DNA programming. So there seems to be some kind of scientific basis for this type of transmission of learning. So, as I said, the shift is not going to come through some kind of magic number. We can reach critical mass, but this does not mean automatically that the whole world is going to be transformed into the human species that all wants to do things the same way. However, the more people that do learn how to relate to each other in a new way, that do see a new way of forming a better society, the more easily other people will be able to assume this kind of consciousness. The new paradigm is going to need to include a combination of the scientific approach and raised consciousness. And our work has to be the work of the head, the work of the heart, of science and spirit, of the eagle and the condor. The next type of analysis of the current situation I'd like to do is to look at the different types of groups who are involved in social change. Now, there are 3 basic types of groups that have similar aims. These aims are the equality of all people, secure basic conditions of life, freedom of expression, sustainable environment, moneyless economy, lack of private property. Now, the 3 types are more communist, socialist, some type of anarchist group. So these are anti-religion and spiritual by nature and tend to be militant in their approach. Then you have people who have a more holistic or environmental or human rights or native people background. And these people are anti-communist, and they are not completely sure about whether or not we need to get rid of so-called democracy. And then the third group is the resource-based economy groups, which include the Venus Project, the Zeitgeist Movement, the Money Free Party, Ubuntu, Copiosis, which all have the same goal, but between which there is little or no cooperation. So at this point, although all of these groups see that there is a need to transform society in which there is equality, a sustainable environment, lack of private property, moneyless economy, etc., there is, we do not cooperate with each other, and that's why we don't achieve critical mass. So because we do not have cooperation, there is the possibility that other scenarios may come into place. For instance, if people are not able to unify towards a common goal, there is the possibility that a world war will be started by the countries in order to give them the opportunity to redistribute and rebuild, as we have seen in the analysis of the other civilizations. Another scenario, which is quite possible, especially when you look at how China is growing and capitalizing on what they have been able to take over from the West, if the U.S. collapses, and other powers such as the Middle East Alliance, China, and or Russia will move into the first stage of building an empire. A third scenario is that environmental catastrophes will bring about survival mode, and people will cling to established structures. And the fourth possibility is that even if an RBE oriented group does prevail, the level of conditioning still present that encourages personal agendas, conflicts based on ego, disorientation, and power struggles, if a group leader passes away, could still mean that they will not succeed in achieving what they set out to do, much as was the case with the Marxists in the previous century. So how are we going to be able to break this cycle? How are we going to be able to break this wheel? Well, obviously, groups are going to need to unite to put aside individual differences and unite around achieving the common goal. In order to do this and to avoid those pitfalls, I think the following principles need to be, seem to be essential. First of all, the principle of unification. So instead of arguing about our differences, we can focus on the similarities. And this unification has to take place across borders, classes, background, and sex. In fact, it's extremely important that any system that comes into place is not some kind of white privileged thing that gets imposed on people. It has to be built upon the input from people all around the world. Another point which seems to be important is that we have to devote time to development and the raising of consciousness. So that means, on the one hand, that people get the right kind of information, and on the other hand, that people learn to be able to meditate or to be able in some way to disassociate with their subconscious or their conditioned mind and be able to work from out a heart, from out an elevated consciousness point of view. Our economic system has to be based on sustainability, on the flourishing of all being and the planet. And as far as technology is involved, it has to be responsibly used to support the planet and the universe. Also, once the groups have united, it will be very easy for them to take advantage of all the various models for change which have been researched and effectively used by businesses and corporations for many years. So we're not going to have to find out how to make things better. There are enough models that we can use once we all decide to work together to bring them into being. So when we look at what needs to be addressed when we're talking about moving from this situation into the future as a united force, we're going to be having to look at these 4 points in how to move from here to there. We're going to have to be looking at what form of economic transition we will have to make. And various groups have various schemes, ranging from a gift-based income to Bitcoin to vouchers. Prognosis has also another scheme. So we need to talk about these things to come to a scientific analysis about what is the best means. In terms of the military, we need to also approach this intelligently. We can take lessons gained in the protests at Standing Rock, for instance, in which veterans joined the Indian tribes and offered their apologies for what the army had done to them. I think that the dissatisfied military will be more than interested in looking to work together for a better future as well. In terms of political items that need to be addressed, we have to use the political arena, or well, we may not have to, but we can, and there are 2 groups that are involved in this, and using politics as an arena for getting people to informed about the RBE, the money-free party, and the other one I've forgotten the name of, but they're using politics as a way to get the message across about RBE. And finally, we have to address how to get people unlearning the current conditioning and developing a holistic RBE consciousness now. And that means activists, all of us here involved in this great work, have to be not pointing the finger at people and saying that they have to work on their consciousness, but taking the responsibility to unlearn our own conditioning and raise our own consciousness. So if we do get into a point where we can make decisions, that these will not be coming from a point of ego or of competition or of power games or anything like that, but that it will be coming from a unified perspective of sharing and cooperating for the best possible future. So to conclude my presentation, I just wanted to reiterate a few points that I've made. The stage of decline has obviously been reached in our current society, and the analysis of key factors has shown that we are now facing growing instability and a growing number of people who are eager for change. When a new approach, we've also seen that when we reach critical mass, when a new approach is adopted in the consciousness of humanity, it will spread as a standard form exponentially. That means you have I don't know what that is. Okay. Maybe it's my phone. This new manner of consciousness has to focus on mind, so the ego that is awakened and learning intelligence, and also on the heart, on the unified humanity and elevated consciousness. In our principles, we need to focus on unity, on learning and consciousness, a sustainable economy, and a life-supportive use of technology. And once we unify, there are tools at our disposal to implement this shift. The rest of my presentation is full of sources that I've been citing in this presentation. And although I have cited many of them, I haven't got all of them. But I hope that that you will find them sufficient. Even kijken. Die voorstelling is ja. I hope you will find them sufficient to understand the point I was trying to make. That was all I had. Are there any questions?
Do you guys have any questions to the presenter?
I don't have any questions, but that was amazing, Charlotte. I love that presentation.
Thank you all.
So thank you for Charlotte. It was a very informative presentation and thorough analysis. So yeah, I've been hearing the term critical mass for quite a while, especially since this month after the Mini World Summit. So I have a question. I think you brought up that issue. So I realize we have so many charities, NGOs and POs. I mean, they more or less realize there's something not right with this system, but that doesn't mean they want a completely change. So how would you address that? You're muted.
I'm having problems with my mouse. Yeah, that's one of the points that I addressed. You know, we've got these three basic types of groups. So you have the sort of hardliners, so those are more the communists and the anarchists, and those are anti-religion, anti-spiritualism. And then you've got the more holistic, the more GPO, NPO types, environmental, social welfare. And these are groups that are sort of sitting on the fence in terms of the need to get rid of capitalism or not. I think in terms of your question, how to get them to change their mind, basically, I think there are two answers to that. On the one hand, as you've seen in the figures that I've shown, the situation is getting worse and worse. It's not like things are this bad now and they're going to get better somehow all by themselves. So pressure on the environment, pressure on social groups, pressure on institutions is going to increase. And people are going to be less and less convinced that the current form of government will be able to solve it. So that's one thing. But another thing is the reason I made this presentation in the first place, namely that third group of organizations, we RBE supporters, need to unite and stop instead of fighting with each other. If somebody from a group for social change takes a look at some of the Facebook conversations going on within these groups, they're not going to be impressed by the level of consciousness and unity and well-being that is being expressed by some of the activists who are posting these. So I think we as activists really have to make a serious effort to unify around common aims, which doesn't mean that each group has to become the same. That just means cooperation, instead of saying, oh, you're completely wrong, or no, it has to be our way. But just working together towards the common goals in the way that they are able to do. Does that answer your question, Stephanie?
Yes, thank you so much. Any more questions from the audience?
I might have one question. Either is a question or even a considering. May I speak?
Yeah, please.
It's about the groups being divided. As far as as I know, as far the information gets to me, either in groups like Zeitgeist movement, either other groups like our own for the Venus Project and so on. I don't see much of that, and at the same time, I want to believe there are no one or either of us are wasting either our time and our efforts to argue some divisions that we might have. So the question, the direct question, it would be, can you give us some examples of these debatable things are being done?
You're muted, Charlotte.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, Nuno, I don't exactly understand what you mean. You want some examples of what?
Of people talking either on Facebook or any other means being argued for one side the Zeitgeist movement, for instance, and the other side the Venus Project, for instance.
Well, specific examples are not really that important at this point. I come across them quite a bit, and I don't think that's. I think it's more important to focus on how we can work together. I don't think that any group is wasting its time. Let me put that right away. Don't think any group is wasting its time, and every single group has built up a following, has got people who are working with them, because the people working with them happen to resonate with that particular way of working. That's fantastic. So this again is the reason why I say no group has to give up what they're doing. They should keep on doing what they're doing. The only difference is we should be doing it together. So and be able to just see that we're all working towards the common goal, and to be able to pool our resources and things like that. So Nuno, I was not implying in any way that there has been any wasted time. No, we should be happy with every single person that joins any one of these groups. I'm just saying that instead of thinking that one particular group is going to be able to accumulate the 350 million people necessary worldwide to achieve critical mass is not is maybe not realistic. And the other problem is we don't have the time. We don't have 10 years. We don't have 20 years to get this together. We've got 1 or 2. And that would make working together to, you know, I think that would make such an incredible difference to be able to counteract the growing threats that are coming to the environment and to society. If all these groups were able to work together, and that would encourage other types of groups to work together. This is what I'm looking at in terms of critical mass. Does that answer your question?
Not particularly. When we think that either the Zeitgeist movement, for instance, and the Venus Project, for instance, are aiming and working towards a resource-based economy, for instance, first, how do I don't see how this parallel work, it's either equivalent work. I don't see how there are so many differences between
No,
these
I
two.
don't see it
And
either, but I think Andrew would like to say something.
All right. So yeah, as a chapter coordinator for the Zeitgeist movement in Richmond, Virginia, in the United States, just like to say the aims of TZM have never changed, and that of other organizations that promote the same types of goals actually don't necessarily work in a parallel, and I'll explain that. TZM from the start, and you can read this almost in the first couple of sentences in the introductory to the Zeitgeist Movement Defined, which is a free book that you can download on the website, or you can order a physical copy, which, I have the PDF and the physical copy because I'm that much of a geek. We say right up front that TZM is not trying to make it happen in the ways that we want to go and build a city. Our objective is to educate people and to help shape the culture, which is one of several prongs in this attack. I don't like using words like that, but it's one of several different types of things that need to be tackled at the same time. Now, the Venus Project, I would say, the organization's probably a little bit smaller, but they work with a lot of very credentialed individuals in the ways that they actually have a lot of blueprints designed. They have engineers, and Jacques himself was a structural engineer and a social engineer. So, and he spent a lot of time actually hitting a table and writing and drawing and coming up with all these schematics. So there are different organizations, and we are working towards the end goal, but for different reasons. So TZM still hasn't changed. We're still trying to educate people. That's our priority, because we could build one of Jacques' circular cities, and like so many people have pointed out, the governments of today would probably bomb it, to the point where you would never have known anything was there. They would completely destroy it. So culture first, culture is something that kind of has to be tripped into first. We have to discuss it from at a point of view that we're like trying to, we've got to orient the arguments around how culture is today. Arguing about, you want a car because you want to be able to go somewhere. So you don't really want the ownership, you want the utility. The utility is what's important. So we have to place arguments like that in and around trying to in and around society, and hope that again, I don't like this kind of terminology, but germinates and expands and grows in a way that you think a plant might, or something like that. We have to work in it from that direction. There are also organizations like the was it Money Free Party, or is that what they're called? They work to try to angle this type of argument to the political system, which is something that isn't being done from TZM's perspective or the Venus Project's perspective, even though I think Jacques, while he was still alive, did receive an award from the United Nations, which I think was awesome, that they got that kind of publicity with an organization whose goals, and I'll say goals, maybe not actions, but their goals are to create a more humanitarian future. In the Venus Project, but the Zeitgeist movement, people like myself who've tried to kind of stick it in as my term papers and my presentations in college, and tried to gather with people locally that have the same kind of perspective, I would say, on the political left, or Peter Joseph, for instance, who is still giving lectures in universities in California while working on his new trilogy. There are all of these different angles, and I know it seems like nothing's getting done, but what's beautiful is it's all getting done, but from like different angles. And Tony, who works with the World Summit, this was something that I was telling him about, because he was like, I would love for you to come work with us at the World Summit, and maybe you should just leave college and do stuff like that, and you can work with us. I was like, well, what you're doing is beautiful. What you're doing is beautiful because it works the cultural angle too. But I'm a social science student, and I'm hoping to one day be able to I would hope to influence the structures of society too, because we're not going to be able to get all of the dominoes to topple, if you will, if we're all working from one of those planes. You know, we have to come at it like the Money Free Party with the political system. We have to come at it from a cultural and educational perspective like the Zeitgeist movement. We have to have the plans and we have to have the blueprints, everything ready to go if we get to trip that percentage of the population and everybody starts like, you know, maybe this is a good idea, you know. So we have to have all of those angles, and they're all working towards the same goal, and that's what's kept my head above water, and it's kept me, you know, pushing as hard as I am in college, because I know that it's going to happen. It's going to happen, and it's got to happen from all of these different tiers. So I hope that helped. I'll put the mute back on, and you know, if you have any more questions or inquiries for Charlotte, go right ahead. I do have some questions for you after he is finished, though, just to let you know.
Thank you for the insight, Andrew. Do you have any more questions, Nina?
Yes, a short concern. That's it, Drew. You nailed it. I was supposed to know that. For the information that comes to me, definitely the Venus Project members are always, I say, working towards to build the city, always this is cross city, the city with a resource-based economy, and definitely Zeitgeist movement members are working towards a new consciousness, as Drew said. For that, I have to agree with you both, Drew and Charlotte, for that. Yes. As a last concern, as a last given of thought, that gives me the suggestion that all these members of these groups, we should, like Charlotte says, work together. And I think working together, we should, given in a consensus basis, we should aim particularly one for those objectives, and that should be on a consensus basis, and we should working together mainly for one of one of the objectives that are aiming for these groups. Yes.
Yeah, and just as an addendum there, is I think you make a really good point, you know, about working together and things like that. The World Summit as an organization, their initial mission was to help develop a platform that organizations like the Zeitgeist Movement, Venus Project, Money Free Party, United Earth, all of these organizations were supposed to be able to come together almost like a big conference. That was kind of what my initial take was from World Summit. They are in the process of they're in the process of getting everything like organized, and yeah, I mean, they're, you know, we'll hopefully see from that kind of a thought gene that will bring these groups together and kind of have this World Summit or this conference that's the initial aim. So
yeah, thanks, Andrew. That you really said it quite well and iterated the different approaches quite well. And what you also made clear is that every single one of these approaches, and not only from RBE groups, but all the other groups too, we can all learn from each other. You know, it's nobody knows everything. Everybody knows something. So, you know, we can learn from the environmentalists. I mean, how are we going to learn better about how to make a sustainable economy than to consult with people who have been working with the environment their entire lives? So, yeah, that's what's making me also optimistic these days. Andrew, you said you had a couple of questions or points?
Yeah, questions. Well, one of them was to actually just kind of, well, it was to go through and address things with TZM, but everything that I talked about with Nuno just kind of nailed that down. So what, Charlotte, my first question for you, and it's not about the topic specifically, but perhaps a subtopic that I thought of as you were talking about them. What is your take on NPOs, like the Section 501c3?
And what do you mean by my take on?
Okay, so like the Venus Project and the Zeitgeist Movement have 501s. Do you think that creating a 501 for a movement that aligns with these types of goals is a bad idea? Do you think that it protects people, or do you think it's inherently like some kind of flaw? It's all part of the game that we're trying to avoid.
No. Although I am absolutely no expert on this, I mean, really, I know very little about it. But my basic conviction is that things are not flawed. How they are used can be flawed.
Yes.
So it all comes back to consciousness and how people use things. The fact that I use these 501s in the presentation is just because I found it remarkably difficult to find any information on the internet about how many groups of people there are working for social change.
Yeah.
And I don't think this is a coincidence.
Yeah. Well, as capitalism has climaxed, we've seen a massive increase of human rights abuses and obviously environmental degradation as well. So where a correlation between the rise and all of the bad things and the rise in the number of NPOs, correlation may not be causation, but I would like to think it is, because these people are arguing for the social change. So I'm glad to hear that you kind of take a neutral stance on the NP or the device of a nonprofit organization. I too agree with you that the aims are what matter. It's just a structure. It's a little thing, and it depends on what you fill it with. And I use that kind of argument with the government for perhaps a lot of people just say the institution of a government is, or it is absolutely corrupt. They think that the behavior itself is because of the structure, but no, it really has to do more with the inhabitants of the structure. But we all know as resource-based economy advocates that we have much better ways of managing things than a government. So it's outdated, but the structure itself by itself may not necessarily be inherently corrupt. So
Andrew, if I could just break in there.
Sure.
It's sort of that which came first, the chicken or the egg? So do the material structures shape the way things are, or does the consciousness with which the material structures are used shape the way things are? And everybody I talk to, I say, Marx, he said, once we change the material structures, the labor relations, consciousness is going to change on its own. And the fall of the Soviet Union, the corruption of the Chinese Communist Party, these have both proven that if you don't have a change of consciousness going on at the same time as working towards or changing the structures, you're really setting yourself up for a really, really dangerous situation in which all kinds of monstrous things can happen.
Yeah.
So that's how I see it.
Yeah, and I'd also like to add that along with consciousness, and we have to consider the things that shape consciousness. And our economic models, regardless of left or right, communist or capitalist, are all based on scarcity. It's not about trying to escape it. It's about trying to, in our case, in the modern world, is about actually preserving it. So yeah, that also shapes the consciousness. So it goes back farther to that root causal mechanism. And with the intentions of folks like Marx and anyone on the left, perhaps, it's addressing that very staple in every type of economic system that has existed throughout history.
Yeah.
And then you can't really look at it. Corruption is a word that we throw around a lot as a society, I guess, but really it's kind of just a part of the whole gig. Now that our technology is caught up to us, caught up to a point where we don't need to preserve scarcity. But let's see. So a second question, and it was a follow-up still about NPOs, and of course, Charlotte, I'd appreciate your answer first, but if anybody here has any kind of expressions on how to answer this question, it would be greatly appreciated. Nonprofit organizations, by and large, tend to address very specific problems within the society itself. It's not about the society or the structure as a whole, and they often and those specific things are that they target their symptoms, but not a cause. So a lot of NGOs, NPOs, and foundations that are trying to address this one little thing, they aren't realizing that there is a systemic reason for it. So we can agree that there's a lot of people that want change, but they're looking to change the system as it exists. How do we as a group that wants to look beyond that pale, how do we try to communicate with them about maybe reanalyzing what it is they should be trying to fix?
I've been watching Steve's videos this past week, and he does a really good job of it. And I think we could really expand on more of that kind of thing. But yes, that's what you're saying is absolutely true. Most groups who are trying to somehow work for social change really focus on an individual symptom and don't understand what is at the basis of it. And I'd say that that's an area that greater minds than mine should really be looking at. Marketing departments in all kinds of organizations need to look at how do we get this across and let people know the idea that we need money, that money is as old as the apple in the Garden of Eden. We get rid of this concept, that people understand that it's just a form for regulating distribution when there isn't enough to go around, and that it's no longer necessary. This is a message that indeed has to be communicated. But I think if the different RBE groups start working together and start reaching out to other organizations in a sort of unified way, that here in Holland, for instance, we've got a group called Milieudefensie, and the Partij van de Dieren. So that's the party for the animals and defense of the environment. And I know I could walk into those places and talk to them about what I'm working for and what we all stand for, and they would be very well, the ideas would be very well received. So yeah, that's why I think unification is such a big unity of coordination of efforts, and unity of purpose is such an important thing.
Yeah, we just have to be careful not to trip over the cult of personalities that exist in the egos. Sometimes the egos get kind of big, and I won't point any fingers, but they exist.
It wasn't me.
And also, I guess this is more of a statement rather than a question. But of course, since I became an active RBE supporter, and I guess a person who tries to formulate arguments about the market and for a resource-based economy, I've always heard the time argument. Like we've always got to be concerned with how much time we have. I think that in the time argument lies something that scares me more than maybe perhaps what we're up against. So I guess like falling into darkness with absolutely nobody trying to stop it is a terrifying thought. But what we have now are a lot of organizations that want change, but they don't necessarily know how to organize themselves. And the problem of that not being able to organize themselves is because they are afraid to run a structure that has a parallel to things like a business. I think that has to be a fear that we have to address, and we do have to understand that, like, this is the system that we don't want to live in anymore, but it is where we are. This is where we want to go. We have to find that middle ground, and we have to use things that are in the system or have been created by the system in order to try to bring about that gap. You know, where a lot of people in TZM and this and the Venus Project, they keep talking about, when is the transition going to happen? You're living in it right now. You're living in it. So like with what you said about MPOs, I totally respect that. Makes absolute perfect sense. It's all a matter of how you use it. And what happens when you try to run an MPO is that you try to get money in order to be able to fund your projects, whether they're education projects, media projects, marketing projects. You have to have the funding in order to be able to make that, you know, happen. So we have to consider funding, and with funding comes things like having an accountant, and you want to talk about micro, macro economic calculations that can help bring about this. You're going to need people with those types of educations to be able to do it. And I'm all for groups that may not have, you know, people that are self-taught or have degrees. They can go around and talk about all this stuff. They don't need to go to college for it. But I think that we should try to expand into that hemisphere a little bit more, and perhaps try to find people willing to educate themselves or get an education in those professional fields that will help us, you know, complete the transition that we're already cracking the door open to.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. You know, and that's one of also that fact is recognized in the World Summit. That and also that's something when I do things here in this group. You know, I tried any presentations. I tried to have at a certain level, a certain standard, because I know at some point people from the intelligentsia or from the professions are going to be checking things out, and then there has to be a certain degree of validity and basis for being respected in what we have to say. So.
Yeah, with the World Summit, and I thought I'd just speak to you on this since we're here, and I'm sure, you know, given the questions that led up to this, it'd probably make a lot more sense now. With the World Summit, I think it would be wise to try to follow that type of type of train of thought with the legal protections, especially if they're looking for funding, because you know, you can get.
Andrew, can I interrupt you there, because our meeting is recorded for the audience who.
Oh, okay, I understand. Sorry.
The resource-based economy. So let's discuss.
Sorry.
Sorry. No worries. It's okay. Yeah. So, anyone has more questions on the critical mass? This particular topic is on. And welcome to the meeting, Steve and Yuri. Probably you have to catch up the video. We're gonna upload the YouTube later. Yep.
Can you hear me there? Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed the beginning. Charlotte, you were talking a little bit about the World Summit meeting, were you? Yeah.
What's your question?
Oh, at the beginning of this meeting, were you talking about the World Summit where you were last week? No? Okay. I missed the beginning. I'm running short of time. I'm taking care of my mother. We have another caregiver coming in here in a few minutes, and my wife and I are going up to town to do stuff. So I got to take off in 10 minutes. I didn't have much time to pop in. I love to see all your faces. I love my RBE friends. Good to see
we
you.
love you too. And you know the presentation is going to be on our YouTube channel as well. So if you want to see the first, you can check that out.
I know that. So I want to see the first. And, you know, I'm just finishing up this project I'm working on with making a website for the Money Free Project, Money Free Party USA. And it should be done in a week or so. And yeah, it'd be great to come on here in a future meeting. And where you guys can look at that and see what you think about, you know, what I'm doing here is talking about taking a first step just making, and the Federal Reserve, the central bankers, just making that the main thing. Take it back the way the founders of this country wanted to, the Congress to be issuing the money. Okay, let's do that. And then let's take this next step from scarcity into abundance and prove to ourselves that we can produce the things that people want with very little human labor. And at that point, we can remove the price tag. We can go beyond money at that point. So I don't want to lose a bunch of people right off the bat saying, let's just go to money, let's go moneyless. You just have to get rid of money completely here, because you do lose a lot of people that way. And I think if you just start off with, let's just get rid of the central bankers, that'd be the first step. I think you'd have everybody on your side. So anyway, I'd like to, when you guys get a chance to see that, and I'm going to make a little video that goes with it, and next week or two, it'd be great to talk about that with everybody in the coming weeks, whenever it works out for everyone.
Definitely. In fact, in my opinion, that's one of the reasons why a kind of consensus system with all the groups being able to contribute and to really discuss all the ideas and not just keeping to one particular ideas is so important. I think it really has to be something that everybody is able to contribute to. Any decisions about currency, about money, anything like that, everybody has to be able to give some kind of input.
Right. Okay, so great. I'll let everybody get back to it. And I'm going to keep listening for the next 10 minutes until I take off.
Okay.
I'll have to take off. Great to see you all. Thank you.
Too.
You, Drew, too, after listening to your guitar playing.
Oh, yeah.
We have that in common. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. You're very talented yourself that way. So.
All right, thanks. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we end the meeting, Charlotte, would you like to end the meeting with some takeaway message?
Yes, I would actually. Now, although on the moving forward page there are no other events listed yet, I have got several people who want to be giving a presentation in the coming months. So I just wanted to list a few of them. First of all, I've asked Andrew here to give us a presentation on how he sees veganism as a means having a place in a resource-based economy. I've asked Jody and Rogers from the Money Free Party to come give a presentation on how they see the political realm as a way of promoting the message of RBE. I've talked to Troy Wiley about giving a presentation on what a gift-based economy is, a gift-based income is, as a possible transition form towards RBE. I've talked to Leo again about talking about how the progress has been going on their project that they gave a presentation on. Was there somebody else? Maybe somebody else that I can't remember. So these events are going to be coming on the calendar soon. And I think there's, oh yeah, and also someone else from the World Summit from the Envienta organization who's got a scheme for first issue currency as a way of funding our groups in moving into the transition or moving further in the transition. So these will all be coming on the moving forward page in the near future. So keep them, keep your eye on them. And that's all I had to say.
Thank you for the marvelous presentation, and I will see you guys next meeting. Thank you for coming. See you.
Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for coming.